Hey guys, so last time we started our new series on how to study the Bible, and we talked about how the first step was setting the stage. We discussed the importance of prepping the body, the mind, the heart, and now we will be talking about step 2, which is laying the foundation. Now, a lot of times when you read the Bible, we jump right into it, which can be a good thing sometimes, but it can also be a problem if we move too quickly. Now, if you're building a house, the first thing you have to do is lay the foundation. Why? Because if you don't focus on the ground first, everything you build will fall. And it doesn't matter if the walls, the doors, and the windows are straight. If the ground is wobbly or if the foundation is crooked, the whole house will be messed up too. The same is true when you study the Bible. Before you start reading, you need to lay the foundation, and you can lay the foundation by answering these 5 questions: who, what, where, when, and why. The first one is who. Before you start reading a book in the Bible, you need to do some research first and then answer some specific questions like, who was the author of the book? Who was the author writing to, or in other words, who's the audience? And who are the characters involved in the passages? You see, a lot of times we can read books like Ephesians, Philemon, James, or 1 Peter, and we can think, yeah, these are some great books, but we need to remember that they aren't just books, they were letters written by someone to someone else for a specific purpose. So make sure you find out who the author is, who the audience is, and then identify who the characters are in the book. Next is the what question. What's happening in the book? What's the author going through? What's the audience going through? What are the characters going through? What's the historical context? Or in other words, is there any big historical event that happened while this book was being written? This is an important question to answer because it gives you perspective as to what is happening. After the what question, you ask the where question. Where are the events taking place? What region? Where in Israel? What city? Are the characters traveling anywhere? What do you know about the places that are mentioned? If you need help answering these questions, you can always check out an atlas or study Bibles that have maps. So you have the who, what, where, and now you have the when question. When was this book written? You have to remember that Elijah, Moses, Paul, Joseph, son of Jacob, and King David are all different characters living in different time periods. So before you read, you need to ask yourself, what time period is your book in? Around what date was the author writing this book? Answering this question helps you understand the timeline of the biblical events. And finally, after you answer those 4 questions, you have the final one, which is the why question, which is probably the most important one. Why was this book being written? Why did the author write the book? Why is it so important? Why is the book in the Bible? Altogether, this question looks at the purpose of the book. Now, I know this sounds like a lot of information, and you might have to rewatch this video again to look at all the questions, but answering these questions are absolutely crucial if you want to go deeper in your Bible reading, and I'll give you an example. Let's look at the book of 2 Timothy. The author of this book was Paul, and he was writing to one of his best friends, Timothy. While Paul was writing this letter, it was around 66 to 67 AD during the Neronian persecution, where Christianity was deemed illegal by the Roman government, so Christians were dying for their faith all around them. Paul was in prison while he was writing this, and one thing that Paul consistently repeats throughout this letter was endurance. He writes to encourage Timothy to endure hardship and endure pain and suffering, and Paul writes this to Timothy because Paul knows that his time is coming to an end and he will soon be executed for his faith. You see, with this little paragraph, I was able to answer the who, what, where, when, and why questions. Paul wrote it during the Neronian persecution, in prison around 66 to 67 AD, and he wrote it to encourage Timothy to endure hardship like Paul is now. And answering these questions are important because it gives the book context. If you read 2 Timothy chapter 1, verse 7, it reads, "For God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind." You see, if you read this verse without answering the who, what, where, when, and why questions, you might think that this is a nice verse, and you might think, wow, I shouldn't fear. God has given us a spirit of power, love, and a sound mind. But if you answer the 5 questions, it adds weight. When Paul was writing, God hasn't given us a spirit of fear, he was on death row. He was about to die. Can you imagine the fear during the Neronian persecution? Can you imagine the worry and the anxiety? It can make you forget who God is. That's why Paul says, God hasn't given us a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind. Paul was able to say this in prison, on death row, and if you research 2 Timothy, you'd know that this is the last letter written by Paul. So part of Paul's last words to Timothy and to the church was not to fear, but to remember God has given you a spirit of power, love, and a sound mind, or in other words, God has given everything you need to get through the situation you are currently in, no matter how disheartening it may seem. So do you understand the importance of laying the foundation? By doing so, you're able to gain context and are able to get more out of the passage. Now, I know this sounds like a lot of work, but you need to answer these questions if you want to lay a solid foundation. But note, you don't have to answer all these questions alone. Try to get help if you can. If you go to a church, try to ask a pastor these questions. They should have some books that you can look at. In fact, Hallie's Bible Handbook is an amazing resource you can get for pretty cheap as well. In fact, other good resources to have in your library are Bible handbooks, Bible encyclopedias, and a good study Bible. Bible handbooks normally give you a summary of the books of the Bible. Bible encyclopedias give you all the historical and cultural details, and study Bibles go in depth and give good commentary throughout the whole Old and New Testament. They also have a good introduction at the beginning of each book that would probably answer the who, what, where, when, and why questions. Now, I'm sure we'll post another video going into more detail about Bible resources later, but until then, try to talk to your pastor or a Bible teacher you know if you need help laying the foundation. So remember, who, what, where, when, and why. All important questions that you must answer if you want to study the Bible more effectively. All right? So that wraps up part 2 in our series, How to Study the Bible. Join us next time as we analyze the text even further. Hope you guys have a good one, and God bless.